Joining me now, Justice Minister David Lametti. Minister, good to see you. You tabled this bill saying mandatory minimum sentences don't work, that they contribute to the overrepresentation of people of color and Indigenous Canadians in the justice system. What is the overwhelming evidence that mandatory minimums for certain crimes don't work?
Well, statistically, it bears out. It's demonstrated that Indigenous people represent 5% of the general population and 30% of all federally incarcerated inmates. Same is true with respect to the Black population, 3% of the population, 7%. Percentages are even higher for women. And there's a disproportionate number of Black and Indigenous people charged and found guilty of offenses carrying minimum mandatory sentences. So there's a lot of statistical evidence. I can also add they clog up the court system. There is, almost half of the charter challenges challenging parts of the criminal code are challenging minimum mandatory penalties. Most of the time, with respect to drug offenses, they're successful almost 70% of the time, and almost 50% of the time they're successful with respect to firearms offenses. So they just haven't worked, and other jurisdictions have figured it out. The United States, hardcore conservatives are now saying it's time to abandon, and there's been movement in the United States to abandon minimum mandatory penalties, and it's time to do it in Canada.
But so some folks might say, okay, well, you're not taking them away from everything. You're only taking mandatory minimums away from other things. If they don't work, why not go further and repeal all mandatory minimum sentences?
Look, this is an important step today. I'm proud of this step. I think I'm the first Minister of Justice in recent memory, and maybe the first Minister of Justice ever to begin rolling back minimum mandatory penalties in Canada. So it's an important day. We're turning a ship around on a tough on-crime policy that has failed. We've targeted specific offenses that are sort of low-level gun possession offenses, or certain crimes using long guns. And then we've targeted drug offenses. So we've targeted offenses that are very particular to overrepresentation, the overrepresentation problem. And as I say, it's an important step.
Okay, well, there's certain gun offenses, as you say, certain drug offenses. The entire mandatory minimum wave, and this started in the 70s in the US and in the 80s and then in the 90s here in Canada, was simply because on those particular cases, many believed that judges were simply making mistakes. They were giving light sentences that were too light, too discretionary, and that animated the entire movement for mandatory minimums in the first place. How do you know that's not going to happen again?
Well, the statistics just didn't bear out what the goals were in those earlier periods. We've ended up with higher incarceration rates. We've ended up with incarceration rates of, frankly, people who had other kinds of problems, health problems, mental health problems, other problems. And I'm not worried, quite frankly, that moving away from that we won't get to a better place. The other thing to remember, what we've added today, is we're loosening the Harper restrictions on conditional sentence orders, and this allows for offenders who are not in any way a threat to public safety and who would have gotten less than 2 years. We allow the judge to craft a sentence that doesn't put that person in jail, puts them in house arrest, allows them to keep their job, allows them to get mental health support, allows them to get drug rehabilitation or drug treatment support, allows them to go into a restorative justice program and allows the GLADU sentencing factors to work for Indigenous people, right, or the IRCA factors for Black Canadians. All this is good, and I think it will lead us to a better place, better outcomes, less recidivism, less clogging up of the criminal justice system.
What happens to those Canadians who have already been impacted by what you say are the poorly crafted mandatory minimums? Will anything be applied to them retroactively? This was the same issue where a lot of people were, arrested or had criminal records because of pot possession, then it was legalized. What about for people who have been penalized by a mandatory minimum sentence that you said targeted them unfairly because of their ethnicity?
Look, the law isn't retroactive. A number of those cases are playing themselves out in the courts. We'll continue to watch those, but as is the general rule, we don't make retroactive laws.